First, I thank Vice President Vincent Hsu for your kind words and your very warm recollection of our more than 30 years of friendship. I'm particularly honored by the presence of President Ma, whom I had the pleasure and honor of hosting to dinner in my home and at the Bak Kut Teh stall in Singapore, which unfortunately closed down at the end of July. And in the Bak Kut Teh stall are pictures of me with President Ma. And I was very nostalgic, so I took pictures of myself against that picture, knowing that the stall will be closed. I'm delighted to be here today, and I want to thank Dr. Kwan Chisung Mao for arranging this visit for me to Taiwan. I'm so happy to be back. I want to thank the organizations, the university, and other, and the foundations, of course, for sponsoring this organization and arranging, making all the fine arrangements. I first came to Taiwan in 1976. I had just graduated in England, gone over to the US to train in the US Army for 3 months as a signals officer. Then I went to Hawaii. I decided I wanted to visit Taiwan. On our passports, we were not allowed to visit Taiwan or Dalu. But the Taiwan consulate in Honolulu made special arrangements to put the visa on a separate piece of paper. So I applied for the visa, and my arrival in Taiwan was a little uncomfortable because the customs were very strict. There was a little box which I used to keep little things. The customs official took it up and said, "This is from China," and threw it away. I was quite stunned. And in fact, in my suitcase, I had the collected works in 4 volumes of Mao Zedong, with the covers torn out because I was afraid of Singapore authorities. Then I thought, wow, if the Taiwan customs official had seen the works of Mao Zedong, I would have been, I think, caught up for a friendly conversation. So I was a little rattled my first visit. My mother was from Shantou. She married my father when she was at the age of 19. And she had always told me that Taiwan is a part of China. And the only reason why it was separate was because of the Americans. Now, she was not pro-communist because the family suffered a lot because of the overseas Chinese connection. But she was always loyal to the idea of China till she died. So I came with a certain baggage in my mind. And I had a relative here who invited me to dinner. They were high KMT officials. I don't know who they were. And I didn't quite like the way when the waitress spilled something on one of them, their reaction. I said, "Oh, this is a little too strong." I think at that time, Taiwan society was quite repressive. It was the first stage of economic development, and many Westerners considered Lee Kuan Yew also to be quite repressive. And looking back, yes, he was. Because without law and order, you can't create the conditions for development. Then I went back to work in the army. A year later, I came back to Taiwan for training in Henzhou. And it was incredible because Taiwan gave us such incredible facilities. We wore ROC uniform, without the ranks, without the badges. The entire camp was vacated for our use. And Sing Kwang Po being trained all over Taiwan. conducting live firing. I learned that Lee Kuan Yew had a very close relationship with Jiang Jingguo. Jiang Jingguo treated him as a younger brother, he's 13 years older than Lee Kuan Yew. And I think, without saying so, wanted a Chinese majority Singapore to succeed. And to succeed, we had to pick up the gun. To pick up the gun, we had to learn how to use the gun. We needed training areas. And Taiwan, in those critical years when we were most vulnerable, provided us the training areas. Which is why Singapore will never forget Taiwan's contribution to our independence. I remember one year at the Chinese New Year gathering for grassroots leaders in Singapore. There was no media publicity. And Lee Kuan Yew gave a speech. He said, "The mainland considers me an old friend, but Taiwan is an older friend." But in his interaction with Jiang Jingguo, he made clear that one day Singapore will recognize Beijing. And when that day happened, the ROC flag, the ROC crest in Singapore would have to come down. So when we established diplomatic relations with China in 1990, there was no issue because there was never any false expectation. Jiang Jingguo was getting old, and Lee Kuan Yew was briefing us in cabinet that he was already going to dismantle martial law, Taiwan would enter a new phase of development, and Singapore ministers would have to know new Taiwan leaders. I also remember him saying that regardless whether or not we had diplomatic relations with China, he would have to come to Taiwan for Jiang Jingguo's funeral, which he did. I was in the army, then was posted to the Air Force. My first boss in the Air Force was an ROC Air Force pilot, Fu Chun-hsien. I think he was a one-star general in Taiwan, but because in Singapore we all had low ranks, so he became a lieutenant colonel. A wonderful person from Shandong. And I learned so much from him, not only about the Air Force, but also about China and Taiwan society. He was famous because he was the first ROC fighter pilot to shoot down a mainland MiG with a sidewinder. So I think the mainland had his records. So one day he told me, "I'm going to China, to Dalu, to Shandong." Singapore at the time had no diplomatic relations with China, but they had an office in Singapore. So he went to the office in Singapore with his Singapore passport and asked for a permit to enter China, feeling a little anxious. But in fact, the Chinese knew his complete background and said, "Look, is there anything we can do for you when you visit our Jiaxiang?" He said, "Oh, no need, not necessary." And he had a very good visit, and after that he went back repeatedly. And a few years ago he died in Los Angeles. And I sent online my message of condolence to my old boss. Then I became Director of Joint Operations and Planning. And then I came to Taiwan as a senior officer, and I met many Taiwan generals and drank a lot of Tao Liang Jiu. And I learned one thing, that the higher the rank, the better the quality. And the less the hangover. It was for me a glimpse into an old China, where many of the officers were from Shandong, and very warm people. When I became a minister, Lee Kuan Yew taught me many things. And in many cabinet meetings, he talked about Taiwan. In 1989, the first APEC meeting was held in Canberra. It was at the same time as the Berlin Wall came down. And at that first meeting, we were talking about the three Chinas, meaning the mainland, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and how to bring them in. The following year, we had a meeting in Singapore, and we kind of agreed that APEC should be an economic ministers meeting. And when the leaders met, it was not a summit, but a meeting of economic leaders. Then the following year in Seoul, where I met Vice President Vincent Hsu for the first time, an agreement was struck that no flags, no political names at APEC, Taiwan and Hong Kong will be represented by one minister. And then the following year, in 1992, in Bangkok, Taiwan was represented by Vice President Vincent Hsu, China by Li Lansing, Hong Kong by Brian Chow Tak-hei. And at lunch, we gathered, it was a buffet, together to eat. I felt that I was like a relative joining a family lunch. I was so emotional. I can't remember what we discussed, but I remember the significance of that gathering where the discussion was intimate, friendly, casual. A period in history has passed. 1992, 九二共识. 1993, the Wanggu talks in Singapore. Now, Singapore was not involved in mediating the two sides. Singapore only provided tables and chairs. But why did they choose Singapore? Because they felt that Singapore was friendly, meant both sides well. And I was involved in preserving Wang Qingyuan, which Sun Zhongshan先生had stayed in many times, where some of the uprisings against the Qing dynasty was organized. So I said it must become a national monument for us. And Lee Kuan Yew opened it as a Sun Zhongshan Nanyang Jineguan. And Feng Chonghan, the director, there was a big boulder cleft in two. On one side, the calligraphy by Hu Zhenfu, the other side, the calligraphy by Wang Daohan, expressing the hope that one day the boulder will come together again. And leaders of both Taiwan and the mainland had been visiting Wang Qingyuan, not only as a Jineguan, but almost as a shrine to a common origin and the hope for a common future. When I became trade minister in 1999, negotiations were already going on.